We started the book of Daniel, and we should be going on to chapter 2 this evening. But I had a request to talk a little bit about what is Babylon, and because of that, we're going to take a few moments out of this evening and just focus on that question. So I don't know how long that will take us, but at the same time, I'm going to we'll continue as long as it takes for us to thoroughly understand. Since it is our Bible class and I'm answering a question, what I'd like to do is just to open the room that if open the door that if anybody wants to ask any question or to have any further clarification, then of course go ahead. Now, when we talk about Babylon, of course, we are referring to Revelation chapter 18 primarily. We have mention of it in Revelation chapter 14, 13, 14, where we have the three angels' messages. But primarily, the description we have of Babylon is Revelation 17 and 18. So in identifying Babylon, those are the chapters that we would want to focus on most of all. And I know that in our studies over the past few months, we have focused on Babylon, and we have probably gone through this, but I'm going through this again for the benefit of this person who asked. Now, of course, let me just make a general, lay down a general principle. All of us are aware that the book of Revelation is written mostly in the language and in using the imagery of the Old Covenant. It's a very important principle to bear in mind when we are going through the book of Revelation. So most of the entities that exist in Revelation, or many of them, are taken from the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. For example, Israel, Babylon, Egypt, and even many of the other references, Sodom, and even the names of persons, places, Armageddon, and so on. All of these are references that point us back to the writings of the Old Testament. And what God is doing in the book of Revelation, He's using the stories and the entities of the Old Testament to point to events and entities in the end of time. We can learn at least two lessons from this. Number one is that history is repeating itself. What happened in the past is to happen again. But it happens again in a different setting and in different circumstances, different entities. So why does God use the parallel? Why does he give these names to modern day entities? It's because what he's trying to say is that the same spirit and the same principles that existed back there in the past comes back again at the end of time. It's building on the principle that there is nothing new under the sun. Satan uses the same methods, different circumstances, different people, different situation, but the same principles again and again. So we say Satan is a deceiver, he's a murderer. This is true in every age. Satan tries to confuse people. It's true in every age. And so God brings us back to Babylon in the end of time. The second thing, as I pointed out, is that whatever, when God identifies these entities, and He says, for example, this is Babylon or this is Israel, what we can know is that we can look at the old one. We can go back to the Old Testament and look at that first Babylon, that first Israel, that first Egypt, and we can discover things about that first entity that will help us to understand the new Babylon, the new Egypt, the new Israel. Now, there's a way that I can demonstrate this very easily, and I think probably to the satisfaction of most of us in this room. Instead of just talking, let me open up my Bible, and I'll just actually bring up the verses that I am going to be commenting on. For example, I'm going to use one example that I know we all should agree with. I guess there are people in the world who might not agree, but I think most of us in this room will agree with me in what I'm about to say. It says in Revelation 7 and verse 4, and I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 140 and 4,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. I think all of us will agree that Israel here is not speaking about the people who were called Israel in the Old Testament. All of us will agree that I think we all will agree. And if you need any evidence to support what I'm saying, I mean there are quite a few places in the Bible, but we could quickly look at Romans chapter 2 and the last verse, which kind of lays down the New Testament principle. The last two verses of Romans 2, verses 28 and 29 says, "For he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men but of God." Paul says clearly that when you talk about a Jew, under the new covenant system now, in Christian age, we're not speaking about physical persons who have physical circumcision. We're talking about people who have a certain kind of heart, whose spirit belongs to God, whose spirit has been circumcised, as he would say. It is in full agreement with what he says in Galatians chapter 3, kind of just putting the icing on the cake. He says, "There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you're all one in Jesus Christ." There's neither Jew nor Greek. In Christ, race does not matter. It's one of the reasons why I become really irritated when I find any Christian, whether white or black, becoming fixated on the question of race. I mean, I know that in some cases there are people of various races who treat other races in a very unkind, even wicked way. And I, as a human being, I don't like it. But at the same time, I don't think it's something a Christian should become fixated on. In other words, you should not allow it to absorb your mind and cause you to label people and treat everybody like they are the same. You know, what is important in this world is who is a Christian and who is a child of Satan. Those are the big distinctions. And they are the only distinction that really matter. But then he goes on to say in verse 29, "And if you be Christ's, if you belong to Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed." What he's saying is that if you belong to Jesus, you are a Jew. Abraham's seed was the Israelites. So if you belong to Christ, then you're an Israelite, and you are an heir of God according to the promise that God made to Abraham. So this is what, so when you go to Revelation 7 and verse 4, and it talks about the tribes of the children of Israel, we understand, even though the imagery is from the old covenant, we have to translate it, we have to understand it in a new covenant way. So we know it's not talking about those who are circumcised in the flesh or who are literal flesh and blood descendants of Abraham. We're talking about the spiritual children of God who are Abraham's spiritual children. That is, those who are born again, those who are Christians. And all of us understand this. In the same way, if you are going to interpret Babylon, we have to apply the same kinds of principles. And I think everybody here understands this. So when he talks about Babylon, we understand we're not talking about the city of Babylon, which existed by the Euphrates River. Not that Babylon, not that ancient Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar ruled over. Not somewhere in Iraq. We're speaking about a spiritual entity. Like Israel is spiritual, Babylon is spiritual. But the question is, what does Babylon represent? What does Babylon represent? All right. Well, It's helpful if we look at ancient Israel. Like I said, we can look at the past and learn lessons about the present and the future. If you look at ancient Israel in relation to Babylon, because remember, everything, especially in the book of Revelation, is centered around God and his people. It's centered around Israel and God's dealing with Israel. The other entities only come into the picture, like Babylon and Egypt and Sodom, because they are impacting upon God's people. It's the same reason why in the Old Testament you find Babylon. Babylon comes up because it attacks Judah and carries away the children of Judah and the king of Judah and enslaves Judah for 70 years. Because Israel is the center of God's work upon the earth. All the world is viewed in relation to Israel. In the same way, in the world today, it is true, and I have no apologies for saying it, that the center of God's work and God's affection in the world today is Israel. Not as some poor, confused people believe, those people who are living down in Palestine. No, 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 no. This is the confusion that I find to be so mystifying. I can't understand it. I can't understand how people who claim to understand the new covenant are still fixated on Israel and still believe that the Jews down there in Palestine are God's special people, specially favored. I could never believe that, no matter how much it seems to me that they are specially favored. I could never believe that, because remember, the great principle is that first of all you understand God's character, and when you understand God's character, it helps you to understand biblical doctrine. When you understand God, it makes absolutely no sense that God is biased over a particular race because of the blood in their veins. That is nonsense. Anyway, so Babylon comes into the picture, into the biblical picture, because she is an enemy of Israel. Babylon is the country that carried God's people away captive, and they were held in captivity in Babylon for 70 years until God called them out of Babylon. So bear this in mind as we first of all look at where Babylon is first mentioned in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 14, in the second angel's message, it says, "And there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." So Babylon is, if you compare Babylon to the original Babylon, to the first Babylon, what you can pick up right away is that Babylon must be an oppressor of God's people. It must be an enmity. It must be an enemy of God's people, an entity that oppresses God's people. And furthermore, it says that she makes all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So what can we pick up from this? Let me just focus on the word fornication for a moment. Fornication is an illicit sexual relationship. Let me repeat that. It's an illicit sexual relationship. It's a sexual encounter that God does not sanction. It's hard to look at this and to misunderstand it, because what kind of union is compared to a sexual union that God does not sanction in terms of nations and entities and people? When you go back to the Old Testament, you find over and over that when we talk about spiritual fornication, it's always in the context of Israel mingling with other nations. It's God's people becoming entangled with other powers that are in opposition to God. It's Israel forming an alliance with Assyria or with Egypt, or following the practices of the heathen. Then God accused them of committing fornication, because fornication is a union of two bodies. And because spiritually our heart belongs to God, when you give that heart to somebody else, God calls it spiritual fornication. James follows up on the idea, because James says, "You adulterers and adulteresses, don't you know that the friendship of the world is enmity against God. So James follows up with that idea. So the first thing we can look at when you talk about Babylon is this element of fornication. Babylon, clearly, in my mind, I don't see how we can come to any other conclusion. Babylon is an entity that is supposed to be loyal to God. But Babylon commits fornication. And what does it mean? It's an illicit union, it's an illegal sexual relationship. And in the Bible, this is always regarded as when the professing people of God become involved with other powers, other entities that are not of God. When Daniel was speaking this morning, for those of us who were present during that presentation, he made a comparison between he was talking about principles and how sometimes you don't have the same exact event or the same exact behavior, but the principle is similar. And in fornication, the principle is that your heart should belong in one place, and a certain kind of relationship is not allowed, and you become involved in that kind of relationship. This gives us a clue as to what Babylon is. Now, let me show you why you are compelled to think in a certain way. If the city of New York becomes involved in relations with Paris or with London, would you refer to that as fornication? I certainly would not refer to that as fornication. They are similar entities. It's quite normal for the United States or for the city of New York or for the city of Paris or the city of London to have relationship with each other. All kinds of relationships, financial relationships, exchange of culture. It's normal because they are both worldly entities. You would be stretching your imagination to say that we are talking about fornication. What we are, the only time you would refer to it as fornication, fornication is something that God has forbidden. The only time you could think of it as fornication is if a religious entity becomes involved with another power, another entity that is contrary to God. So I look at that and I see that very clearly. And secondly, it says she made all nations drink. She gives the world something to drink. And what does she give them to drink? It's a wine. It's a wine. So Babylon has made the world drink a certain wine. Where does she get this wine from? I'm going to be very graphic and maybe a little bit gross, but I'm following what the Bible says. God is not as finicky as sometimes we are. But this wine is produced by her fornication. When she fornicates, it produces a certain liquid. And this liquid is called a wine. And she makes the nations drink this wine. What happens when they drink the wine is that they become drunk. They become drunken with the wine of Babylon. I think it says so in chapter 18, but we'll come to that in a moment. So what does this mean? It makes people disoriented and unable to understand spiritual things. Because remember, let's focus on the truth. Revelation is talking about spiritual realities, spiritual things. And it's talking about entities that come in that destroy people's ability to understand spiritual things and to have salvation. Babylon causes the world to become drunk. And when you are drunk, you don't know your head from your foot. You don't know how to walk properly. You stumble when you fall. You lose your orientation of reality and you live in a dream world. That's what happens when you are drunk. What makes the world come to this place? It is because Babylon has produced a perverted doctrine. Babylon has produced ideas that makes everybody drunk, unable to understand spiritual things. What are we talking about? We're talking about something that should belong to God, some entity that should be spiritual and committed to God, that has turned from God to mingling with the world. And because she mingles with the world, her ideas become corrupted, and she gives these ideas to the world. And so everybody becomes confused, unable to receive the truth, to understand the truth, and to live by the truth. And I could give you many examples of this intoxicating wine. I could talk about some of the more blatant false ideas, like eternal burning hell, like the Trinity. Many of these ideas came about by directly because in the early days, Roman Catholicism was seeking friendship with the world. And in seeking friendship with the world, in seeking to create a religion that would be acceptable to the world, what Roman Catholicism did was embrace pagan ideas and Christianize them, give them a Christian meaning to make it easy for pagans to accept Christianity in this perverted form. And as you know, these doctrines have just served to make the inhabitants of the world drunk, to confuse them about God, to confuse them about salvation, and create perverted ideas about what it means to serve God. This is a fact. And so this helps us to begin to understand a little bit more about what we are talking about when we say Babylon. Let me go to chapter 18 and point out something else. In chapter 18, it talks about an angel comes down from heaven having great power, and the earth is lightened with his glory. He cries with a loud voice. He says the same thing that we read in Revelation 14. He says, Babylon the Great is fallen. This time he goes on to say she has become the habitation of devils and a place of foul spirits and unclean and hateful birds. He goes on to talk about all nations have drunk of her fornication, the wrath of her fornication. Everybody is confused and disoriented. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. The merchants of the earth are rich because of the abundance of her delicacies. Now, verse 4 says, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. This for me is very definitive. Whatever Babylon is, God's people are in Babylon right up until the end. God's people are in Babylon right up until the end. At the end, it is necessary for God's people to come out of her. Why? That you be not partakers of her sins and that you receive not of her plagues. Babylon is about to be plagued. She's to receive the plagues. And Babylon, her sins have reached a place where if you remain in Babylon, you will partake of those sins. It says, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquity. So we are looking at an entity that has become so corrupt, so polluted, that God says, I cannot allow this to continue anymore. God's people are there. And so God says, come out. Why do you have to come out? Because if you are there, you will come to partake of her sins, and you will receive of her plagues. What are we talking about? To me, it seems very clear that we are talking about the great system of false religion that exists within Christianity. What are the reasons why we say this? Well, first of all, God's people are still in Babylon. Come out of her, my people. God's people are still in Babylon. Is this speaking about a physical location like New York, like Paris, like London, like the Vatican? Is God saying, if you are in Johannesburg or you are in Kingston, find somewhere and move? Because if you stay in the city, you're going to partake of the sins of the city. If God is speaking about somewhere, some literal place, you know what he has to do? He has to talk about every single city in the world, every major city. Because the wickedness that you find in San Francisco is in New York, is in Miami, is in London, is in Paris, is in Berlin. There's no city in the world that is not laced with wickedness, some more than others. But when God says of Babylon, my people have to come out of her, this particular thing, God's people have to come out of her. Is he calling us to physical movement or spiritual movement? Is God saying, change your location, change your geography? Or is he saying, change your system of worship? I'm going to leave you all to make that decision. In my mind, it's very clear. God says, if you remain here, something has happened. Babylon has reached a certain condition. And if you remain in union with Babylon, you are going to partake of her sins. And you're going to experience her plagues. And that makes perfect sense. Because look here, it's a truth of life, it's a fact of life that birds of a feather flock together. It's a fact of life that a man is known by the friends he keeps. It's a fact of the scripture that two cannot walk together except they be agreed. Yes, Brother Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, I got a question. We know when it references her in the Bible, it's considered a church, and so is this saying come out of the fallen churches like Sunday and the Adventist church because of what they're teaching nowadays?
I'm going to take a little time to answer your question, Brother Tony. The thing is that I've been through the whole spectrum of beliefs because when I first was introduced to Revelation, it was through Adventism. And of course, I was led to the idea that the Roman Catholic institution is Babylon. And as I studied a little bit more, I came to the conclusion that the Sunday keeping churches are Babylon. And as my mind became free and I began to look at the principles of what it means to oppose God and to be in false teaching, I had to adjust my thinking. And I came to the conclusion that it's not just Catholicism and false Protestantism, it's more denominationalism. It's more, it's more the principle of connection with denominations that connects a person with Babylon. And the person who actually helped me to come to this conclusion, most of all, was A.T. Jones. And how did he do this? I'm going to show you, I'm going to take us to the three things that Jones pointed out that made sense to me, and it helped me to identify this Babylon.
So actually, you saying there shouldn't even be no denominations?
I'll put it another way. To say there should be no denominations is like saying there should be no cities. I mean, you can't tell the systems of Satan what to do. What I'm saying is that God's people at a certain point in time must sever their connection with denominations.
Yes,
And there are
amen.
there are some very striking reasons for this. I'm not saying I don't believe we're at a place yet where it jeopardizes your salvation. Well, let me put it, let me
Can I
withdraw.
interject?
Let me withdraw that. I think it jeopardizes it, but you don't lose your salvation by being in connection with the denominations. But there comes a time when if you remain, you will lose your salvation. At the moment, it's simply putting yourself in jeopardy. When you join in union with something that is consistently standing against God, you are jeopardizing your salvation because you're standing with something that God cannot support. It's a dangerous place to be. Go ahead, Brother Ray.
Yes. This just ring a bell. I just forgot the Bible text that the son used this morning. The beautiful Bible study that he gave, and I think it goes back to back. Where it references not to follow after men, be separate. I don't think it has to do with denominationalism, rather with individualism. As like when your son was explaining this morning that we need not to. We do a lot of things. We conform with the things of the world. That's what it ended with. So I think they go back to back.
Yes, the same principle, Brother Ray, absolutely. Now, in Revelation, Genesis 11, A.T. Jones emphasizes this, and I mean, it's just three sentences, but at the same time, I've found that, especially when you look at the Old Testament, sentences can carry very deep meaning. For example, when God says, "The seed of the woman shall bruise the serpent's head," the whole gospel was in that little verse. So when you find three statements that are made by the Babel builders, I'm not surprised, I'm not opposed to the idea that every one of those sentences has deep implications, because they come to this plain in the land of Shinar, and they decide to build a tower. And they say, and here are the principles, because this tower is the beginning of Babylon. Babel is the foundation of Babylon. Babel means confusion, and that is essentially the key component, or one of the key components of Babylon. So to understand what they were after when they decided to build Babylon in its origins, in its very beginnings, is to help us to I beg your pardon, is to help us to understand the very foundation on which Babylon is built. And Daniel said it a couple of times. I agree wholeheartedly. If you want to understand underlying principles, you sometimes need to go back to the beginnings, to the origins. So they said, let us build us a tower. And the first thing they said, these Babel builders, whose top may reach unto heaven. They wanted to make their own way to heaven. That's the first mark of Babylon, a system that tries to reach heaven using human methods. The second thing, let us make us a name. The second principle of Babylon is that they wanted to become famous and well established, and to have a foundation in the world that people could look at and admire them. Let us make us a name. And Jones made a point that the very word denomination, well, it comes from the word denominate, right? The verb is denominate, the noun is denomination. Denominate means, do we know what it literally means? It means to make a name. The word denominate means to make a name. So a denomination is a system of men making a name. That's what it means. And that's the second principle of Babylon. And the third principle is, they said, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. The third principle is what we call centralization. They wanted to congregate everybody under one central head, so that they could better take control of human beings and of the whole human race. So these are the three principles of Babylon: making your own way to heaven, denominating, and centralization. A system where you have centralized power. And what do I mean by this? I mean, like Catholicism. Where's the power in Catholicism? It's in the Pope and the Vatican, and it's in the College of Cardinals, but primarily it is in the Pope. Where is the power in the Adventist Church? It's in the General Conference. They tell you that the General Conference is the voice of God, and it is true in most denominations. Jehovah's Witnesses have their headquarters in New York, somewhere in New York. All of them have a centralized place where they have made this place like Jerusalem. They have made this place like the sacred temple, where everybody looks to this place for direction and guidance, where something stands between you and the God of heaven. Something stands between you and God, that if you want to reach God, you have to go through this thing, this place of centralized power and authority. It's a principle of Babylon. And when I learned this from A.T. Jones, my mind was never again as limited as it used to be. You see, what Adventism has done, they have made your denomination is Babylon and my denomination is Israel. It's okay, you can understand, because Adventists say we are Israel. They have denominated Israel. They have moved away from the biblical principle that Israel is a people who are born again. Israel is a people who have the Spirit of God in them. It's not a denomination. You can't take Israel and lock them up in a box. Adventism has done it. They have built on the Old Testament principle. So it is normal for them to say, well then, Babylon is the same thing. They build on the Old Testament principle, and Babylon is also a denomination. But once you understand these principles, you are no longer looking at a denomination. You are looking at entities that have the principle of Babylon. These are modern Babylon. Jones made another point. Jones made another point. Equally important. Jones said that one church group stands here and they say, come out of Babylon and come over here. Come out of Babylon and come over here. But he said, when God delivered Israel from Babylon, where did they go? When God delivered Israel from Babylon, where did they go? They went to Jerusalem. But that was old Jerusalem. So when God delivers you from Babylon today, where are you supposed to go? And obviously his answer was, you're supposed to go to New Jerusalem. Paul says in Galatians 4, Jerusalem which is above is the mother of us all. Come out of Babylon, my people. Come to New Jerusalem, not to a denomination. The antithesis of Babylon is New Jerusalem, the home of modern Israel. So it's very clear to me that Babylon today is not one particular denomination. It's a system of religion that closes people's minds to truth, where people denominate and they try to set up a centralized system of power and they set up their own way to heaven. I'm focusing on Adventism. You know why? Because that's a system I believed once upon a time when they said that to be in Zion, you need to be a part of our denomination. I heard a pastor. He was the secretary of the conference in central Jamaica. I heard him preaching. I still have the sermon. He said, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the gate of heaven. This is what they tell the people. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is the gate of heaven. And then he says, and once you're at the gate, you're there. He taught that the way to heaven and the door to heaven is a denomination. This is Babylonian heresy and foolishness. The tragedy is that so many people listened and so many people believed. The poor minister who disfellowshipped me, he's dead now. But he said to me, do you know that when we disfellowship you, you cannot be saved? My only reaction was to feel pity for this man as I said, you think you can take my name out of the book of life? But I'm just saying it to highlight the point that they have created their own way to heaven. It's the first principle of Babylon. Make our own way to heaven. The way to heaven is my church. The way to heaven is my beliefs. And I know that it's not every Adventist teacher who will teach that kind of foolishness, but it's so infused into the thinking, into the teachings. If nobody says it outwardly, it is latent in the things that are taught. They're just underlying idea. God's people are they that keep the commandments of God. We are God's commandment keeping people. We are the remnant church. When you combine all those things together, how can you help believing that this is the door to heaven? So even if nobody says it, the teachings and the doctrines push you in that direction. All right, so it's raining heavily here. Anytime that happens, I start to talk very loud. So I'm glad for a moment's break. Go ahead, Brother Tony.
Yes, so you're saying that God's people should have no dealings with no type of denominations, and soon, Do you think that it's going to be a salvation issue if God's people continue to stay in these denominational churches?
I absolutely believe that there's a time that is very close when if you remain in a denomination, you're going to lose your salvation. I was cautious to say this kind of thing at one point because it's not good to be dogmatic and it's not good to try to promote where you are. I'm outside of the denomination, so somebody might say, well, you can say anything because you're outside, but it's not just this. It's that when we look at the principles of the scripture, it's very clear. If you consider the question, all right, why did the Jews reject Christ? Why did they reject Christ? The Bible tells you as clearly as anything. If you look at John 12, it's just that the nature of denominationalism is such that it's destructive to true religion. Um, Look at this verse 42. Among the chief rulers also, many believed on him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. They rejected Jesus. Man, it's really pouring here. Give me a second. Let me close my window. Um, are you all able to hear me very well still? All right. I have to just control my. There's a psychological impelling to talk louder because I can't hear myself. And when I talk louder, I begin to lose my voice. So if you can hear me, I'll have to try hard just to maintain my normal tone. My mind is telling me speak louder. All right. So yeah, it says that because of denominationalism, why do you think they crucified Jesus? Why do you think the people that had benefited from his healing, people whose children he had healed, people that he went about doing good, why do you think they shouted, crucify him, crucify him? Because their church told them to do it. They saw glory like they had never seen before, but they were so committed to the idea that my church, my organization, this is God's entity on earth. They were ready to stand against God himself, to stand in favor of the church. And that is the danger, Brother Tony. That is why I always say, you can talk to people about the Trinity all you want. You can talk to them about any doctrine all you want, and sometimes you'll make headway and sometimes you won't. But you'll never really make any true impact until you break the loyalty to the system. That's the only
Amen.
time you'll ever see any real change, because there are myriads of people who believe like we believe, at least as far as the truth about the Godhead is concerned. But they are firmly connected with the system. And because of this, they never really have a meaningful impact in the cause of truth. And the churches are reasonably comfortable with them. The moment when your mind opens and you begin to learn is when you are free from that denominational bondage. When you come to the place where you can really accept that this is not God's favored entity, and I am free to think for myself, and I owe no loyalty and commitment to this worldly, this man-made system. When your mind is at that place, then you will be free. I mean, I could visit the churches, any of the churches today. I could visit and it would not be a problem, because when I visit, I have no loyalty. I have no sense of loyalty. I have no commitment. I have no delusions that what I'm hearing is going to be the voice of God. I could go there like Jesus went to the temple, like Jesus went to the synagogue. But the problem is that heart loyalty that makes me think I need to have some kind of commitment to this system. So those are the comments on Babylon this evening. I don't know if the person who asked if you have something further that you would like me to comment on. Let me just
David.
yes, brother Ayayi. Go ahead, my brother.
Um, so I understand very well what you're saying. Babylon is not just a religious system, but it has a name like Christian organization.
Well, I'm not thinking of the name Christian.
Okay.
I'm thinking that each denomination is a part of Babylon because each denomination builds on the principle of Babylon. One says I'm Lutheran, one says I'm Wesleyan, one says I'm Baptist, one says I'm Seventh-day Adventist. Each of them is trying to make a space for himself in the world. They denominate. So each one of them forms a part of this great Babylonian system. That's how I see it, Brother Ayayi.
So like paganism is not part of Babylon. So
You ask a challenging question because the question is, are Muslims or pagans, is it a surprise when they commit fornication? Are they supposed to be committed to God? Because when we talk about Babylon and fornication, we are talking about something that should belong to God that now is connected to the world. So the question you ask is a little challenging because I would say every institution that is involved in religion should be committed to God, whether it's Islam or Hinduism. But at the same time, it's challenging because who could have expected Hinduism or paganism or witchcraft to have any kind of loyalty to God? So I'm tempted to think more in line of those who call themselves Christian. But I'm not going to set it in stone because, as I said, there's a little reason why you could think maybe it involves all religious entities. But I don't have a clear answer. Anybody else?
thank you, Brother David.
You're welcome, my
I
brother.
think, I think, Brother David, emancipation, paganism has to do everything and anything that's against God because we say pagan wrong, like the Pope, pagan, the Catholic Church is pagan, it's paganism, but yet in paganism, there is a lot of truths mixed with errors. And they're all, one way or another, they're worshiping God. So in general, it all falls in general, paganism with religion as well. Because you could have the right religion, but you could have a religion, but you could also have paganism mixed in with the truth.
Yeah, the reason why I'm a little cautious in that area is because when we talk about Babylon, I mean the idea in the Bible is that people should be committed to the true God. In the old covenant, it was Yahweh. That was his name. When you come to the new covenant, it is still Yahweh, but with a greater understanding based on what Jesus has brought to us. So the religion of Israel, if Israel is God's people, what we are looking at is that Babylon, fornication, if Babylon commits fornication, it almost seems like it should be Israel, a part of Israel that has gone into apostasy and so becomes Babylon. I'm going to show you something in the Bible that kind of, what I'm saying might sound a little confusing. Let's look at something in the Bible that kind of supports what I'm saying. When you go to Revelation chapter 18, and it talks about the destruction of Babylon, look at what it says here in verse 24, Revelation 18 and verse 24, when he talks about the destruction of Babylon. And I'm going to mute everybody after. If you want to talk again, you'll have to unmute yourself because something is creating a little disturbance. It says in verse 24, and in her, that is in Babylon, was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. This is another reason I can't believe Babylon is a physical place. There's no place on planet Earth where everybody who ever died was slain. We're talking about a spiritual entity that whose tentacles reach into all forms of life and society. But the principle of Babylon is what is being identified. And the principle of Babylon is what has been responsible for the murder of God's people in all ages. And let me show you where Jesus supports me in this. If you go to Matthew chapter 23, I believe it is. Matthew 23, look at what Jesus says. Jesus was speaking of Jerusalem. But in speaking of Jerusalem, he, of course, is speaking of the whole Jewish nation. In verses 34 and 35, Matthew 23, wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes. And some of them you shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall you scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city. So he's not talking about Jerusalem. He's talking about the people of Israel, because Jerusalem is not what persecutes people from city, out of Jerusalem to city. It's the Jews. That upon you, upon the Jewish nation, may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth. Isn't that what God says about Babylon in Revelation 18? In her was found the blood of all that were slain upon the earth. Jesus says the same thing about Israel, same thing about the Jews. Revelation 18, look at the verse again. In her was found the blood of prophets, the Music King James Version. In her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. Jesus says the same exact thing about Israel. So who was Babylon in the days of Jesus? In the days of Jesus, Babylon was the organized religious system of Judaism. And what was the true church in Jesus' time? When Jesus says, fear not, little flock, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. The true Israel was those who were in Christ, and who and even though they were mingled among the Jews. But at that time, there was a time when they had to come out of Babylon. They had to flee Jerusalem. They had to flee Judea. They had to leave the environs of the Jews, and they had to head for the mountains. Because if they remained there, the wrath would have fallen upon them. Jesus told them to flee out of Judea when they saw certain things beginning to happen. And they did, and they were physically saved. Jesus gives us a similar sign, but now he's talking about a far greater Babylon. The Babylon of the end time encompasses the entire planet. God's people are in Babylon all over the world. It's not so much a physical fleeing from Babylon. It's the liberation of your mind. Coming out of Babylon means to have your mind liberated, because we are dealing with spiritual realities, not physical things.
David.
Go ahead, Brother Matt.
Haven't we heard that the fulfillment or the reviving of the beast in its full capacity is persecution against God's people? His deadly wound was healed, and right, so that healing is the beast's rising to its full capacity of persecuting power on the earth. So if the righteous blood of Abel all the way down to Zacharias, and for the Jews, and for Babylon, it was all those that were killed, all those that were slain, that you slain. It's that same persecuting. Because I found that in the beginning in Genesis, Abel was slain for his his obedience by the same principle of violence that the Jews practiced against the prophets and Jesus and whoever else, and Babylon did the same thing to all those who followed their own conscience. It's a principle of Satan that they're following. So
I would just add this element to it. Babylon persecutes in a different way than the beast persecutes, because there are two different entities. Babylon's enmity is for a religious reason. And so Babylon cooperates with the beast in attacking God's people down through the ages. False religion has always used the secular power to persecute God's people all through the ages. But the reason is because Babylon is seeking to promote her religion. If you look at Cain and Abel, which you mentioned, why did Cain kill Abel? Because God rejected his religion. He brought his own sacrifice. It's a question of religion. And God accepted Abel and didn't accept Cain. So Cain killed Abel. And down through the ages, the conflict has always been false religion versus the true religion of God. But sometimes the religious power has the power to persecute, and sometimes it doesn't. And it uses the secular power to carry out that persecution. In the case of the Jews, they use the secular power to crucify Christ. They use the secular power to persecute God's people right down when they no longer had the power. Sometimes they did, and they stoned people like Stephen. Other times they got the Romans to do their dirty work. Until the time came when the Romans became fed up of them and they destroyed Babylon. They destroyed the Babylon of that day. Just like the Bible says, the beast and the 10 horns will destroy modern Babylon eventually. They will turn against Babylon and they will eat her flesh, make her naked, and burn her with fire. So history will be repeated again on a far greater scale. But the restoration to power of the beast, I don't see it equating to the development of Babylon. Babylon is riding the beast. So as the beast comes to power, Babylon maintains her alliance with the beast, and so she maintains her influence. And she uses this influence to persecute God's people. But the rise to power of the beast is the coming into power of a secular system that will exercise great power and that will be used to persecute God's people until eventually it will even turn against Babylon, destroy Babylon, and try to destroy God's people. So that's the way I see it, Brother Man.
right, and it all comes from one source, though. I mean, basically, it's Satan.
Absolutely.
It just, Brother David, just to make just a few points, where Babylon is concerned is that we agree that Babylon is always classified to be confusion. And also, we can look on Babylon again that she always classified to be a her. The Bible always classified call her her. So she is definitely referring to a religious movement, a religious system, as it were, as a church system, because we know that in prophecy, woman is really church. So that is few of the things that we can look on. One of the things also that really kind of annoy me is that most of the time we still have people like us who say we are not a part of Babylon, but we are still in addressing some of these daughters, because we also see in Revelation 17 where the Babylon system is classified as a whore that has daughters. Now, who are these daughters? As you say, that the daughters are really the denominations or this organization that is all over the world. And most of the time, we are still calling these daughters the church. And that is one of the things that we need to break out, a mold that we need to break out. That's a tradition that we need to cut out, because we are still referring to the daughters of this war as the church. Also, another point that I would like to challenge some of us or anyone is that if we can see, if we can find a daughter of the whore that separate from the mother and does not have a part of the teaching that the mother has, then I would love to see that, because every denomination have one of the fundamental principles of the mother harlot. So that is one of the main reason why we can't be a part of any denomination. That's what I just have to say.
Yes. I'm going to make one last point. I can't compete with the rain. It's so loud, I can hardly even hear the comments that are being made. But and it's dark outside, almost as dark as night. It's the hardest rain I've seen for a long time. But let me say this: whatever Babylon is, it existed when Cain killed Abel, because the blood of Abel is found in Babylon. It existed in the days of the flood, when they were before the flood, when the antediluvians were killing innocent people. Babylon existed. Babylon is not an end time entity, and it did not come into being when when ancient Babylon subjugated the ancient Jews. What the Bible is saying is that we are dealing with principle, and the principles that exist at the end of time, when things come to a final climax and conclusion, the principles that are seen in the great false system, they were there from the very beginning, even before the Babel builders actually built that ancient system. The principles were there from the beginning. So that's the point I want to make. Babylon was in the garden. Babylon was in the world when Cain killed Abel, because that's what Jesus says. From the blood of righteous Abel, and then he went right up to the blood of Zacharias, the son of Berechias, when he was referring to the Jews. And then when it comes to Revelation, it says everybody from Abel right down to the end of time is found in Babylon. So we are dealing with an entity whose principles, we are dealing with certain principles that go back to the very beginning. If we are to identify Babylon, that's where we have to go. All right, so I'm going to stop. I've run out of steam. I'm going to have a prayer and close the meeting. But if we want to talk, fine. I leave the room open and I will listen. But I have to have a rest for my voice. I can't compete with the rain. Let's pray.